They came to Earth with the pride of warriors who had conquered 100 worlds. But on this so-called Death World, what shook them wasn't the apex predators or hostile weather. It was the fragile creatures with no claws, no armor, no weapons, who laughed in the face of danger. The Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Warriors Alliance sparkled under the light of 3 artificial suns. Captain HFY stood at attention, his scaled armor reflecting prismatic patterns across the curved walls. Around him, 12 of the most decorated military leaders in the known universe sat in their raised observation pods, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. "The reports from our advanced scouts are troubling," announced High Commander Zura-Zel, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of combat experience. Her purple-tinged skin darkened a sign of deep thought among her species. "This newly discovered planet, designation Earth, appears unremarkable at first glance, and yet—" She paused, tapping her curved talons against the crystalline control panel. A holographic display materialized in the chamber's center, showing a blue-green planet spinning slowly in space. "Every scout ship we've sent has returned with increasingly bizarre accounts," she continued. "The planet's gravity is crushing, its atmosphere corrosive, and its temperature swings would kill most sentient species. But these humans, they not only survive, but thrive." Captain HFY felt his neck frills twitch with anticipation. As leader of the elite reconnaissance unit, he'd seen his share of dangerous worlds, but something about this briefing felt different. "Permission to speak, High Commander," he requested, his dual-toned voice echoing through the chamber. "Granted, Captain. With respect, we've encountered hostile environments before. What makes this planet worthy of a full council meeting?" Commander Zura-Zel's skin rippled with dark patterns, a sign of amusement. "Show him the footage, General Vorn." The hologram shifted, displaying various scenes from Earth. HFY watched as humans scaled vertical cliff faces with minimal equipment, plunged into freezing waters for recreation, and most disturbingly, actively sought out encounters with the planet's apex predators. "By the Void," whispered Lieutenant Lyra Ken, one of HFY's most seasoned team members. Her sensor stalks were fully extended, a rare display of shock from the usually composed warrior. "These creatures," General Vorn growled, his massive frame leaning forward, "appear to actively seek out danger. They turn deadly situations into what they call sports. They deliberately expose themselves to extreme conditions for something they term fun." HFY studied the footage with growing unease. His species had evolved as apex predators, yet watching these soft-skinned humans wrestle with creatures twice their size made his combat instincts scream warnings. "Your mission, Captain," High Commander Zura-Zel announced, "is to take your elite unit to Earth. Observe the Wastai's humans up close. We need to determine if they pose a threat to galactic stability. More importantly, we need to understand how they've developed such unusual capabilities." "My team will not fail you," HFY declared, straightening to his full 3-meter height. "We'll observe without detection and gather the intelligence needed. Choose your team carefully," advised General Vorn. "The gravity alone will require extensive augmentation, and the atmospheric composition. I've already selected them," HFY interrupted, gesturing to the warriors standing behind him. "Lieutenant Lyra Ken, our stealth specialist. Scout Solan Vek, our environmental expert. And combat analyst Dreken, whose species can withstand the most extreme conditions we've encountered." The council members exchanged glances. their various biological indicators showing a mix of approval and concern. "Very well," High Commander Zura Zel concluded. "You depart in 6 rotations. Your primary directive is observation only. Under no circumstances are you to engage with the humans. If they truly are as resilient as our initial reports suggest, we cannot risk open contact until we understand their full capabilities." As Kael'var led his team from the chamber, Scout Solan Vek spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Captain, the atmospheric pressure on Earth, it's nearly double what we're accustomed to, even with augmentation." "We're warriors of the Alliance," Kael'var replied firmly. "We've faced worse." But as they headed toward their preparation chambers, Kael'var couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be unlike any they'd undertaken before. The images of humans casually handling situations that would kill most species haunted him. What kind of creatures would evolve on such a deadly world? And more importantly, what were they capable of when truly threatened? The cloaked observation vessel settled into Earth's upper atmosphere with a subtle ripple of displaced air. Captain Kael'var and his team, encased in their pressure-compensating armor, monitored their surroundings. Through an array of sensors, the crushing gravity of the planet made every movement feel like swimming through mineral sludge, even with their augmented suits. "Life sign readings are overwhelming," Scout Solan Vek reported, her sensor stalks twitching as data streamed across her displays. "The biodiversity on this world, it's off the charts, Captain." "Focus on the primary population centers," Kael'var commanded, adjusting his own atmospheric filters. "We need to identify a suitable subject for detailed observation." Lieutenant Lyra Ken manipulated the holographic controls, bringing up a map of the region their advanced probes had identified as the Pacific Northwest. "This area provides optimal conditions for our study. Varied terrain, multiple predator species, and extreme weather patterns." The display zoomed in on a small settlement near the base of a towering mountain range. Kael'var watched as various humans moved about their daily routines, seemingly oblivious to the lethal environment surrounding them. Their combat analyst, Drekken, suddenly announced, his multifaceted eyes focusing on a particular figure. "Subject displays physical characteristics suggesting regular exposure to hostile conditions. Recommend primary focus." The team observed as a human male loaded equipment into a ground transport vehicle. Their scanners quickly compiled a basic profile. Elias Tran, Lyra Ken read from the data stream. Age 28 planetary cycles. Occupation, environmental researcher and wilderness guide. Physical condition suggests regular adaptation to various threat levels. Kael'var studied the human with professional interest. Compared to the warriors of the Alliance, Marcus appeared almost laughably fragile. No natural armor, no enhanced sensory organs, not even basic defensive capabilities like retractable claws or venomous glands. "This can't be right," Scout Solan Vek muttered, running another scan. According to these readings, their bone density is barely sufficient to support their own weight in this gravity. Their skin offers virtually no protection against environmental hazards. Their visual range is severely limited. Yet they're classified as the dominant species on this death world, Kael'var reminded her. "There must be something we're missing." They tracked Marcus as he drove his vehicle up winding mountain roads, eventually parking at a remote trailhead. The human shouldered a pack that seemed comically small given the harsh environment. "He's not even wearing proper protective gear," Drekken observed with what sounded like contempt. "Simple fabric coverings, minimal supplies. Is this some kind of suicide ritual?" "Negative," Lyra Ken responded. Based on his recorded history, This appears to be a routine expedition. The team deployed their stealth drones, maintaining a safe distance as Marcus began hiking up a steep trail. The temperature was dropping rapidly as dark clouds gathered overhead, yet the human showed no signs of concern. Atmospheric conditions deteriorating, Solanvec reported. Storm system approaching, wind speeds increasing beyond safe parameters for his mass and structural integrity. Kelvar watched as Marcus paused to drink from a simple water container, then checked something on his primitive wrist-mounted device. The human actually smiled at the approaching storm. "This species makes no sense," Drekken grumbled. "No natural defenses, minimal technological assistance, and they willingly place themselves in lethal situations. How have they not gone extinct? Perhaps they're simply too primitive to recognize the dangers," Lyra Ken suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. They observed as Marcus navigated increasingly treacherous terrain, making his way toward what appeared to be a research station higher up the mountain. The human's movements were efficient but relaxed, as if the lethal combination of altitude, weather, and exposure was of no concern. Captain Solanvec called out, her voice tense. "Multiple large predator signatures detected in his vicinity. Should we intervene?" "Negative," Kelvar replied firmly. "We observe only. If this human's death provides insights into their species' vulnerabilities, so be it." But as he watched Marcus confidently traverse a narrow ledge while checking his research equipment, Kelvar felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not quite fear, but something closer to uncertainty. Everything about this human's behavior contradicted their understanding of survival instincts. "Update threat assessment," he ordered. "Classification currently undetermined. We need more data before dismissing their capabilities." The others shot him surprised looks, but Kelvar kept his attention on Marcus. The human had stopped to make notes about something, completely exposed to the elements, seemingly unconcerned about the multiple threats their sensors were detecting. "Either these creatures are the most foolishly overconfident species we've encountered," Kelvar mused, "or we're missing something fundamental about their nature." Thunder rumbled overhead as the storm closed in. Elias Train looked up at the darkening sky, adjusted his small pack, and continued climbing. The alien warriors watched in silence, their initial dismissal of humanity's capabilities beginning to give way to something that felt uncomfortably like doubt. The storm hit with a ferocity that would have grounded most Alliance combat vessels. Captain Kelvar and his team monitored from their reinforced observation posts as rain lashed the mountainside and lightning split the sky. Through it all, Elias Train continued his steady progress up the trail, occasionally pausing to collect samples or make notes on his weather-resistant tablet. Temperature dropping rapidly, Scout Solanvec reported, her voice tight with disbelief. Subject's external temperature should be well below survival threshold, yet vital signs remain stable. "Impossible," Drekken muttered, running another scan. "Their technology appears primitive. No sign of internal heating systems, no energy shields, not even basic thermal regulation implants. He's maintaining homeostasis through clothing and movement." They watched as Marcus navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail that had turned into a small waterfall. Instead of retreating, the human actually laughed, the sound carrying through their audio sensors. "Look at his problem-solving, Lieutenant," Lyra Ken noted with reluctant admiration. "He's using the terrain against itself, creating anchor points where none should exist." Marcus had pulled something from his pack, a simple length of fiber rope, and was setting up what their analysis suggested was a basic safety system. The human's fingers moved with practiced efficiency, despite the numbing cold and rain. "This goes against every survival protocol in the Alliance handbook," Kelvar commented. his neck frills flaring with interest. In these conditions, standard procedure would be immediate evacuation, or at minimum, deployment of emergency shelter. The human reached a relatively flat area and did something that made the entire observation team freeze in disbelief. He stopped to eat. "Is he enjoying himself?" Solanvek asked incredulously. His endorphin levels suggest pleasure rather than stress. Marcus sat on a rain-slicked boulder, pulled out a wrapped package of food, and calmly began eating while consulting his research data. A massive crack of thunder made the alien warriors flinch, but the human merely glanced up with mild interest. "New contact," Draken suddenly announced. "Large predator approaching from the northwest. Ursine classification. Mass. Approximately 400 local units." Kael'var tensed, expecting Marcus to finally show some sign of proper species-appropriate fear. Instead, the human slowly stood, secured his food, and reached for something in his belt. "What primitive weapon could possibly—" Lyra Ken began, then stopped as Marcus pulled out a small canister. The bear emerged from the trees, water streaming off its thick fur. It rose to its hind legs, presenting a threat display that would have sent most armed Alliance warriors calling for backup. Marcus calmly raised the canister. "Chemical deterrent," Solanvek analyzed quickly. "But the wind patterns and range should make it completely ineffective." The human shifted his stance slightly, accounting for exactly those factors. When the bear charged, Marcus waited until the last possible moment, then deployed his spray with perfect timing. The wind, Marcus had noted, carried the deterrent directly into the predator's face. "Tactically brilliant," Kael'var breathed. "He used the very environmental conditions we thought would work against him." The bear retreated, shaking its massive head. Marcus waited several minutes, maintaining his position but not showing any signs of panic or distress. Once the predator had moved off to a safe distance, he simply made a note on his tablet, presumably documenting the encounter, and continued his expedition. "Captain," Lyra Chen called out, "you need to see these readings." During the entire encounter, his vital signs showed elevated but controlled stress responses. Heart rate increased only 15%. Adrenaline levels optimal for enhanced performance without compromising decision-making. He's done this before, Kael'var realized. This isn't just survival. This is adaptation. They continued monitoring as Marcus made his way through increasingly hazardous terrain. The human's movements were purposeful but never rushed, each step calculated despite the seeming simplicity of his approach. When Marcus reached a washed-out section of trail, the alien warriors expected him to finally turn back. Instead, they watched in fascination as he systematically assessed the situation, tested different route options, and eventually crafted a solution using nothing but his simple tools and the terrain itself. "Look at his muscle control," Draken noted with professional interest. "Every movement conserves energy while maintaining maximum stability. We assumed their lack of natural armor made them fragile, but their adaptability, it's unlike anything in our combat databases." Chai-Sung. Marcus set up a camp as darkness approached. The process so smooth and practiced, it seemed almost ritualistic. His choice of location demonstrated an intimate understanding of wind patterns, drainage, and defensible positions, all without any technological assistance. Thermal readings suggest the temperature is well below human comfort threshold, Solanvek reported. Yet he's showing no signs of distress. They observed as Marcus efficiently set up his shelter, created a fire despite the wet conditions, and prepared a meal. The human's movements were sure, and calm, as if the hostile environment was simply a familiar backdrop rather than an adversary. "I'm beginning to understand," Kael'var said slowly. "We've been measuring them against our standards of survival, looking for our kinds of advantages, natural weapons, armor, technological defenses, but their strength is in adaptation rather than resistance." Lyra Chen finished. "They don't fight the environment. They work with it." As if to demonstrate their point, Marcus had created a sophisticated water collection system using nothing but his tarp and the natural slope of the terrain. The humans sat beneath his shelter, reviewing his data while eating, occasionally making notes about the storm's intensity. Most species either avoid death worlds or develop extreme specializations to survive them, Kael'var mused. These humans, they've taken a different path entirely. They've made adaptation itself their specialization. Lightning illuminated the mountainside, casting harsh shadows across the landscape. In that brief flash, they saw Eliastran smile, completely at ease in conditions that would qualify as a crisis situation on most civilized worlds. "Update threat assessment," Kael'var ordered, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "Classification highly adaptable. Approach with extreme caution." The storm raged on through the night, but Marcus slept soundly in his simple shelter, his vital signs showing the steady patterns of restful sleep. The alien warriors maintained their watch, their initial dismissal of humanity's capabilities now replaced by growing awareness that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their understanding of species development. This wasn't just survival. This was mastery achieved through endless adaptation rather than overwhelming force. And as Kael'var watched the sleeping human, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only begun to scratch the surface of humanity's true capabilities. Dawn broke over the mountain with deceptive calm. The storm had passed, but Captain Kael'var's sensors indicated worse weather approaching. Eliastran emerged from his shelter, performed some kind of stretching routine, and calmly checked his equipment. "Temperature -12 degrees local scale," Solanvek reported. "Winds gusting to 80 units. Incoming storm front suggests severe weather protocol should be initiated." "He must turn back now," Drekken stated confidently. "Even humans must have survival limits." Marcus checked his weather data, frowned thoughtfully, then proceeded to pack up camp with practiced efficiency. The alien warriors felt a moment of satisfaction until they realized he was continuing upward rather than retreating. Multiple warnings on his primitive devices, Lyra Chen noted. He's aware of the danger, yet his bio-readings show no sign of fear. Determination, yes, but no fear. They didn't have long to ponder this, as movement caught their attention. Their sensors lit up with alerts. "Pack predators approaching from 3 directions," Drekken announced. "Canis lupus classification, hunting formation." The wolves emerged from the tree line, their movements coordinated with deadly precision. Marcus stopped, slowly scanned his surroundings, then did something that made Kael'var's combat instincts scream. He began singing. "What possible tactical advantage?" Lyra Chen began. "Look at the sound patterns," Solanvek interrupted. "The frequency and volume. He's making himself appear larger, more threatening. And the wolves? They're hesitating." Indeed, the pack had paused their advance. Marcus continued singing, his voice carrying across the snow as he slowly, deliberately gathered several branches. The wolves watched, uncertain, as he constructed a makeshift walking staff. "The tool extends his reach," Kael'var observed, "changes his silhouette. Combined with the vocalizations, he's manipulating their predatory instincts." The pack's alpha made a probing advance. Marcus swung his staff in a wide arc, voice never faltering. The movement wasn't meant to strike. It was a display, a message. The wolves tested his position twice more before finally withdrawing. Remarkable threat assessment, Drekken admitted grudgingly. He recognized their intelligence level and adapted his response accordingly. But nature wasn't finished testing the human. As Marcus climbed higher, the new storm system slammed into the mountain. Visibility dropped to near zero as snow and ice pellets filled the air. Wind chill dropping to lethal levels, Solanvek reported tensely. The moisture in his eyes should be freezing. His exposed skin. They watched as Marcus quickly pulled additional gear from his pack. His movements were swift but unhurried as he added layers and adjusted his equipment. No wasted motion, no signs of panic. A sudden avalanche warning blared through their sensors. Before they could react, the mountainside above Marcus began to slide. The human looked up, made a split-second assessment, and sprinted toward what appeared to be certain doom. "He's running the wrong way," Lyraken shouted. "No," Kael'var breathed. "Look." Marcus ran straight toward a cluster of sturdy trees, his path taking him perpendicular to the avalanche's flow. He reached the largest trunk just as the wave of snow hit, anchoring himself on the downhill side. The avalanche roared past, but his chosen position created a protective pocket. "That's not just survival instinct," Drekken said quietly. "That's knowledge, experience. He's encountered this threat before and learned from it." When the snow settled, Marcus dug himself out with the same calm efficiency he'd shown all along. He checked his gear, verified his position, and continued upward. The final test came as he traversed an exposed ridge. A massive golden eagle, its wingspan longer than the human was tall, dove toward him with lethal intent. "Aerial assault," Solanvek called out. "No cover available, no viable defense options." Marcus dropped into a crouch. Not from fear, but from strategy. As the eagle pulled up for another attack, he waited until the last possible moment, then spun to face it with his arms raised, making himself suddenly appear much larger. The massive bird pulled away, its attack run disrupted. Marcus maintained his defensive posture until the eagle decided he wasn't suitable prey and moved on. 3 different apex predator encounters, Kael'var summarized, his voice tight with something approaching awe. Lethal weather conditions, terrain hazards that would challenge our best warriors, and he treats it all as routine. They watched as Marcus finally reached his research station. He immediately began checking equipment and collecting data, as if the journey up had been nothing more than a pleasant walk. "Captain," Lyraken said slowly, "I believe we've been approaching this entire mission from the wrong perspective. We assumed their lack of natural defenses made them vulnerable. But what if that's exactly what makes them so dangerous?" "Explain," Kael'var commanded, though he was beginning to understand. "They have no specializations, so they've learned to adapt to everything. No natural weapons, so they learn to use anything as a weapon. No environmental resistances, so they've learned to survive anywhere." The implications sent a chill through the observation team that had nothing to do with the planet's weather. They'd come to evaluate a potentially dangerous species, expecting to find either overwhelming natural advantages or sophisticated technology. Instead, they'd found something far more troubling. A species that had turned adaptability itself into a superpower. As they watched Marcus calmly begin his research work, surrounded by conditions that would qualify as a worst-case scenario on most worlds, Kael'var, felt the first real stirrings of fear since arriving on Earth. Not of what these humans were, but of what they might become. The blizzard intensified as Marcus worked at his research station, but the human disaster was just beginning. The alien warrior sensors screamed warnings from multiple directions. Ground instability reaching critical levels, Solanvek announced, her voice sharp with alarm. The earlier avalanche weakened the entire slope. Structural collapse imminent. Temperature dropping beyond survivable parameters, Lyra Ken added. And the predator signatures we've been tracking, they're all converging on this location. The storm must be driving them to seek shelter, Drekken realized. The humans' position. A tremendous crack split the air as the mountainside began to give way. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the situation with eerie calm. The ground beneath his research station started to crumble. Multiple fracture points, Kael'var observed tensely. No viable escape route. Even our emergency protocols wouldn't. But Marcus was already moving. Instead of trying to retreat, he grabbed his essential research equipment and sprint climbed up the crumbling slope. The aliens watched in disbelief as he used the very collapse to his advantage, riding shifting sections of ground like stepping stones. Impossible, Drekken breathed. The calculations required for that level of dynamic terrain navigation. He's not calculating, Kael'var realized. He's reacting, instinct, combined with experience. Marcus reached more stable ground, just as the wolves from earlier emerged from the tree line, driven by the storm into a desperate hunt. Behind him, the mountain grumbled ominously. Above, the blizzard intensified. "This is it," Lyra Ken said grimly. No species could survive this combination of threats. Marcus looked around, assessing his situation. Then, to the alien's utter amazement, he grinned. The human pulled a flare from his pack, just as the wolves began to circle. The sudden burst of bright light and chemical smell caused the pack to hesitate. Marcus used that moment to back himself against a rock face, using the terrain to protect his rear. The collapsing ground will force the predators to attack from predictable directions, Kael'var noted with professional admiration. He's creating a defensible position out of chaos. But nature wasn't finished. The rock face behind Marcus began to fracture from the cold and instability. He glanced up, then made a decision that left the alien warriors speechless. He began to climb. "The vibrations will bring the whole cliff down," Solanvek shouted. "Look at his movements," Kael'var commanded. "Really look." Marcus was climbing with incredible precision. Each handhold tested with just enough force to hold his weight, but not enough to worsen the fractures. He'd identified a diagonal route that utilized the rock face's natural stress lines. The wolves paced below, occasionally trying to follow, but retreating from the unstable ground. The storm whipped snow and ice into a frenzy, but Marcus kept climbing. When a section of rock crumbled under his hand, he instantly shifted his weight, turning a potential fall into controlled momentum that carried him to his next hold. "He's not just surviving," Lyra Ken whispered. "He's using each threat to neutralize the others. The height protects him from the wolves. The storm's intensity is actually stabilizing some of the rock formations through the ice. The predator's movement patterns reveal which sections of ground are still stable." Marcus reached a small ledge just as the lower section of cliff face collapsed completely. The wolves scattered, driven back by falling rock. The human immediately pulled out his satellite communicator, using his brief moment of safety to send out data packets and his coordinates. Even now he's focused on his mission, Drekken noted with something like awe. These humans, their determination transcends basic survival instincts. The storm reached its peak intensity. By every measurement the aliens had, the situation was unsurvivable. The ledge was slowly crumbling. The temperature was far below human tolerance. The wolves were regrouping. Marcus checked his supplies, rigged a makeshift anchor with his remaining rope, and started formulating his next move. His heart rate remained elevated, but controlled. His movements were efficient, despite the cold that should have left him unable to function. "Captain," Lyra Ken said quietly, "I believe we need to radically reassess our understanding of Death World species classifications." "Agreed," Kael'var replied. "We assumed that any species surviving in such conditions would develop overwhelming natural advantages. But this is different. They don't overpower their environment. They don't outlast it. They adapt faster than the threats can escalate," Solanvek finished. "Every crisis teaches them. Every survival scenario makes them more dangerous." They watched as Marcus began implementing an escape plan that by their standards was either insanity or genius. Perhaps, Kael'var realized, for humans those two concepts were not so far apart. "New classification," he ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "Humanity represents an entirely new category of Death World species. They are not apex predators. They are not specialized survivors. They are evolutionary improvisers, and that makes them more terrifying than any natural weapon or armor ever could." And as Elias Tran continued his impossible survival performance on the mountainside, the alien warriors came to a chilling realization. They hadn't come to evaluate a potentially dangerous species. They'd come to witness the next stage of adaptation itself. Captain Kael'var stood before the Grand Council once again, but this time there was no trace of his earlier confidence. The chamber was deathly quiet as the final recordings from their Earth observation played out. "As you can see," he reported, his voice tight, "Elias Tran not only survived, but completed his research mission." Search and rescue teams found him 12 hours later, suffering from mild hypothermia but otherwise functional. He was making notes about storm patterns when they reached him. High Commander Zurazel's skin had darkened to an almost black shade, the deepest expression of concern her species could show. "And your conclusion, Captain? Earth must be classified as a Category 1 restricted Death World," Kael'var stated firmly. "Not because of its environmental hazards, but because of what those hazards have created." "Explain," General Kraz demanded, his massive frame leaning forward. "We've been categorizing species based on their natural advantages, biological weapons, defensive capabilities, technological advancement. Humans possess none of these, and that's precisely what makes them so dangerous." The holographic display showed highlights from their observation. Marcus facing down wolves with nothing but sound and presence, escaping an avalanche through pure strategic thinking, turning multiple lethal threats into survival advantages. "Every crisis they face becomes a learning opportunity," Kael'var continued. "Their lack of natural defenses has forced them to develop something far more powerful: universal adaptation capabilities. They don't just thusly survive their Death World, they turn its challenges into tools." Lieutenant Lyra Ken stepped forward, adding her own report. "Their young deliberately seek out dangerous situations for what they call entertainment. Each generation pushes further, tests more limits, finds new ways to turn hostile environments to their advantage. During our observation scout," Solanvek interjected, "we documented over 30 distinct moments where any rational species would have retreated." The subject not only continued, but treated each escalating threat as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a danger to be avoided. The council members shifted uncomfortably as more footage played. Humans base jumping from cliffs, diving into crushing ocean depths, climbing frozen waterfalls for sport. If we ever came into conflict with humanity, Kael'var concluded grimly, our natural advantages would mean nothing. They would study us, adapt to us, and turn our very strengths into weaknesses. Every victory would teach them. Every defeat would make them stronger. High Commander Zura-Zel raised her hand for silence. Your recommendation, Captain. Full quarantine of the Earth system. No contact. No interference. Let them remain focused on challenging their own world rather than looking to the stars. Because if they ever decide to expand... He let the thought hang in the air as one final clip played. Iliastron nearly frozen, resources depleted, surrounded by debris from his demolished research station, calmly making notes about how to improve survival strategies for future expeditions. Motion to classify Earth as a restricted system, Zura-Zel announced. All in favor? The vote was unanimous. As the council dispersed, Kael'var stood at the observation window, watching distant stars. He thought about Iliastron, probably already planning his next expedition, about a species that turned survival into an art form, that saw death-defying challenges as opportunities for growth. They'll reach the stars eventually, Paz, Rai said quietly beside him. Yes, Kael'var agreed. And when they do, the galaxy will never be the same, because they'll bring with them the most terrifying weapon of all, the ability to turn any challenge into an advantage, any threat into an opportunity. He turned away from the window, his final report already taking shape in his mind. How do you classify a species that doesn't just survive the impossible, but actively seeks it out? In the end, he wrote just one line. Humanity, the species that made evolution itself adapt to them. The quarantine beacons would go up within a cycle, but Kael'var knew it was only delaying the inevitable. Humanity would reach the stars, and when they did, they would change everything.